So this is based on both my new book, that's the title of the book, Hope, Despair, and Divided Futures in American Being. No, that's not the title of the book. It's a new title for the summer. The title of the book is at the end. But the idea is that we focus a lot on life satisfaction, eudaimonia, the positive and negative affect measures, and I think those 4 have done us very well, and they're in the statistics here and some other countries. I wish more countries, I wish in the US, but more seem to be woefully behind. But the more, and maybe it was triggered by working on deaths of despair in the US so much, but when I started using well-being metrics to try, I wanted to see if we could, I don't want to say predict, but was there a pattern in which despair began before the deaths of despair? And despair defined, how do you define it? Well, the one we did, we used stress, we used life satisfaction, a whole bunch of the different measures. And what we found was the most consistent indicator of being in a place with lots of deaths of despair, or in a population cohort with lots of deaths of despair, or drops in hope for the future over the past 5 years, which is based on the Gallup questions. It's not perfect, but it just was so consistent. And I started to think more kind of about the difference between hope and the other measures. And I really sort of came to the conclusion, which might be radical, that we should add hope to the measures we collect. And I will try and explain why, and also explain some of the unresolved questions, and obviously really welcome your feedback on those. So let me jump right in. I don't think I need to say too much here, except we do have some guests outside our usual circle. And, I think we know we have a well-being science measurement, and we know the UK government's ahead of everybody else, except maybe New Zealand, which is in a way caught up and doing different things, but also takes it very seriously, and that other countries are jumping on the bandwagon, unlike the US. But one of the things I always repeat when I'm talking to audiences that don't know our approach and what it does, but also just kind of to drum it home, why would you add a metric? There's so many metrics there, and one thing I always get frustrated with is the billion new indexes there are, right? To reinvent the wheel, and that, the living well index, or the well this index. But I think that what we've really all focused on, which is using the same set of metrics so that we can robustly diagnose problems. And I think the metrics are really good because they precisely answer questions that standard revealed preferences don't answer. And one of the big issues when you look at revealed preference data is that there are many times that individuals don't have the agency to make choices, or they're behaving in, as economists would say, in irrational ways. Other people would say they're just behaving like people, but whatever. Anyway, so I think the balance between the two kinds of metrics is where the sweet spot approach is. Now, there are certainly people in this room that disagree with me and think we should only use well-being as an indicator of progress. So can leave that for later. But anyway, and then, as I said, the more I've thought about hope, the more I think we should actually add a dimension to the measures we collect. But again, that's also, I'm sure that's open for question and debate. And then finally, one of the reasons that I've focused so much on hope is that we focus a lot on inequality and well-being, or bad health and well-being, or good health and well-being. But we've never sort of said, what about inequality in hope? We've had some discussion of inequality of well-being. But what I've been finding is that it is this inequality in hope and aspirations, which are linked to how, to people making investments in their futures or not, how that is, I think, as important to things like longevity and productivity and everything else. But again, I want to raise a question about the direction of causality at the end, but let me try and get through a little bit more detail. So we all know the metrics. I'm not going to go into this, except that for those of you that are less familiar with the approach, we're not asking people if they're hopeful, if they're happy. we're we're taking measures of reported well-being, and we use standard econometric equations where the well-being measure is the dependent variable and we control for all these other things. So there may be other sources of bias in how people respond, which we're getting better and better at correcting for, but I think it's just important to note that we're not asking people if certain things make them happy or unhappy. This is an age-old slide, but the reason for putting it up is for a long time, I think we had a fair amount of consensus that there's this U-shaped in life satisfaction over the age curve, and that's the well-known sort of midlife dip in well-being. And we also know that there's a hump-shaped curve with things like despair, antidepressant use, suicide at the top of the hump. But since 2020, maybe even earlier, I think that at least the data for the US show this is not a COVID thing, but rather a bigger thing we don't fully understand. There's been a huge increase in depression, anxiety, low levels of well-being in youth. And so the latest work, which I do agree with this Flower and Bryson work, is finding that after 2020, the U disappears, at least in the US. And it just becomes sort of a flat line with the older much happier than the young. And I think that's something we really need to worry about. And there are lots of reasons for it. I won't get into it until the questions, but that's really striking to me. Okay, so as I mentioned, one reason I got into the whole idea of studying hope is that hope is so linked to deaths of despair. And we've also done some overtime work, not enough of it because we don't have good overtime data, but we have some good overtime data for the US. And we certainly find that despair predated the deaths. And so in my view, that's at least a start in saying we could be using these metrics to warn of places that are desperate or vulnerable to these huge increases in deaths. We also find that despair is also directly linked to poor markers of objective health, high levels of reported pain, opioid addiction, related deaths, as well as labor force dropout. And we've done some work on prime-age males out of the labor force in the US. It's a very toxic group that's not counted in the unemployment rate because they've not been looking for jobs for over 6 months, and yet they're well represented in deaths of despair, in addiction, in radicalization, all sorts of not good problems. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the radicalization, misinformation channel as well in a couple of slides. And then I'll talk about one of the bodies of research I've been undertaking is surveys of low-income adolescent youth and their levels of hope and aspirations, and then they're tracking their long-term outcomes, or at least longer term. I don't have, over the life course data, although we're starting to do some work with a MIDAS survey in the US, which actually we are going to be able to look at life course outcomes. I know some of you, I know Jan and Richard, and I think Andrew too, we're very involved in this sort of life course well-being thing. But so that's another thing, but I want to also do that with hope. And then one of the reasons I think this is important is that if you think about, people's behavior and their economic behavior, their health behavior, all sorts of things, if they don't have hope, they're much less likely to invest in their futures. And as you'll see with things like misinformation, if you don't think you have a future, you'll do everything, including a lot of risky behaviors, because what do you have to lose, right? So, and I'll talk to the direction of causality right at the end, because I'm going to throw out a question, so you have to wake up at the end, even if you sleep until then. So this is also quite an old slide, but one of the things, and it still holds, it's a finding that won't go away, is that in the US, of all the different racial cohorts, the big ones that we have a lot of data for, which are African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and other races, the most optimistic or hopeful cohort of all people is African Americans. And that in a way that doesn't make sense. If you just think objectively, they have more material deprivation, they're discriminated against. There is a problem with a lot of young males being incarcerated, so that could bias some of the gap, but not that much. But anyway, and there are lots of reasons for it, but we also found that until the fentanyl spread in the United States, that African Americans and Hispanics were much less represented in deaths of despair than whites. And part of it is reflected in these reported trends in hope and optimism. And then if you look at these again are these are the deaths of despair up until about 2015. This is Anna Angus's data on deaths of despair. And if you can see, that's a bunch of wealthy countries and, mortality rates going down. The red line is U.S. non-Hispanic whites, right? So, and that's only gotten worse. So since then, we have more, I'll give you numbers in a second, but we have more overdose deaths, more deaths of despair. And some modest changes with the rate of change going up a lot for minorities since about 2018 due to fentanyl, which is a very lethal opioid and sort of rampant in the US right now. But it's a higher rate going from a very low level compared to whites. So either way, our life expectancy has been going down since about 2015, and that trend is only getting worse. The other thing, and it's much harder, as you all know, to sort of robustly measure this, but there's a geographic component to all this, community component. And so if you look at the dark red states, those are those with the highest levels of deaths of despair. They also have lowest levels of hope. They have high levels of reported pain, reliance on disability insurance, opioid consumption, civic and cognitive skill deserts, and voting trends. They tend to vote right and often extreme right. So you can't really robustly analyze this as one package, but you certainly provokes. And then one of the things we've been doing, and can I switch to the interactive really quickly, Jonathan, just to do a snapshot, is we've been looking despair and vulnerability to misinformation. And so we built a little interactive that you can click on a state. Let's say click on West Virginia. And so basically we only have, it should open up, or maybe, you know what, if you go down further. Yeah, okay, West Virginia. So unfortunately our well-being data is only at the state level, it's Gallup data. But a lot of the rest of it is at the county level. So you can look at counties for the things we looked at that were kind of all factors that drive misinformation. A big one is despair, right? So the opposite of optimism as we've labeled it here. Then we look at unemployment, income levels. Income levels vary. They're not really as important as things like unemployment or labor force dropout. Same with the poverty rate, although the same places that are most vulnerable tend to have higher poverty rates, lower rates of unemployment, lower levels of college opportunities, just higher education opportunities. It doesn't have to be four-year colleges. We have that in the data. And then something called cognitive skill deserts. That's Carolyn Minster Hawksby's data, and she has a whole countywide U.S. data set. And it's basically, those are defined as if you graduate high school, what are your literacy and numeracy rates, right? And so if they're very low, below where they should be, then you're in the cognitive skill desert map, and then you're also, the lower you are, the worse you are. And then the other thing that's kind of, COVID vaccination rates as a kind of a proxy for health misinformation. And then finally, local newspapers. And I don't think this applies the same way in Europe or the UK, because the model for news is much more publicly funded. But in the US, local newspapers are being decimated so in these small declining communities, they're just gone. And often the local newspaper in these places is the only source of news about their community. They're not in the national news. And it provides a source of one, credibility of reporting, right? If somebody on the national news says there's a house on fire in your county down the street, and you are looking, there's not a house on fire if there's no house on fire, but in the local news, you can't get away with that, right? I mean, or you can't make, but equally important, they provide us sort of a source of civic community. And, social media is not going to do that. Social media is hard to. So we have lost in the US over 7,000 local newspapers from 2020 on. And guess where they're most often lost? In the communities, declining communities where there are high levels of despair, low levels of civic organization, low COVID vaccination rates, and so on. So you can, the link to this interactive is in the presentation, and if you want, we can click through, look at other places after. But the idea behind this is not to say this causes that. We know we have an idea of all these factors are important. I think despair is clearly probably the most important one, just because of the kind of very direct links to behavior. But right now we're sort of, I don't want to say we're stuck. We're really considering where do we go next? If we were to have one, output variable, would it be misinformation? Would it be consumption of misinformation? Would it be production of misinformation? So it's or other things, lack of trust, whatever. The people have suggested things like relative decline. They've suggested like some index of media quality. Also, everybody suggested something, which is great, but I'm just not sure, or if it's more useful to just start by understanding and looking at the patterns and trying to see sort of, what can we do in terms of all these patterns. Anyway, so that's an open question. So we now have over 100,000 overdose deaths a year in the US, and the suicide has remained flat. This is not an upbeat talk if it's all about hope. Anyway, suicide has remained flat, but the problem with overdose deaths is you don't know if they're intentional or not. So the estimates are that between 15 and 60% of them are intentional. So we can't say, but the huge dramatic rise in overdose deaths is clearly a sign that something is really, really wrong. Okay, very quickly. So hope, why hope? Some of this I've already talked about, but one of the reasons I think that hope is important, or lack of hope is also incredibly important, is that the idea of people in despair just being very vulnerable to radicalization, to misinformation, and it makes sense, because if you don't have hope, you don't have a narrative, you're kind of your life has failed, right? And you're looking for something to, a new narrative. And so these people, if you live in a place like that has all the bad factors that I talked about, you're also much less likely to have the tools with which to combat misinformation. And it really is becoming a very worrisome trend, not just in terms of health and everything else, but in terms of democracy and election denying and all sorts of things. Now, the US is by far the most extreme, but I have done some work with people in Germany who find the same problem, and it's sort of also linked to the rise of right-wing radicalization. So I think we need to think about it. And then the other thing that's really interesting is psychiatrists often write about, or have written about, is how hope is a critical element or a first step to recovering from mental illness, right? Regaining your well-being, but they don't have a clue how to do it, and they haven't even tried. They just say that. It's sort of, and I've worked with some psychiatrists trying to get at this, but it's not as though there's a lesson book out there, right? One of the things I think that gives some root for optimism that we can actually make headway and restore hope in certain places is the idea that hope is a trait. I mean, it's in part genetic, like life satisfaction, but it's in part it's in part determined by the environment you live in. And unlike, say, IQ, which doesn't change much after roughly age 30. These personality traits seem to change much later through the life course. So, if you're thinking about trying to restore hope in places with high levels of despair, and there's there are examples out there. Again, all of this is new. I think there's some room for making a difference. Okay, just quickly. All right, I have 1 minute, so I'm going to be even quicker. But I've talked at least briefly before, I think, about these surveys where I've fielded them in Peru, in low-income neighborhoods in Peru, and where there are incredibly high levels of hope for and aspirations for higher education, not just college, but grad student. And none of these kids have parents who've gone to college, but their parents want them to. They're really supportive of what their kids are trying to do, or else they have a mentor in the community. And then the other place I did it, these are unlikely comparisons, but is in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, which is if you could think of a state, not only does it border on eight states or share a border with 8 states, but it has every problem in the U.S., all concentrated in Missouri. But in the U.S., I interviewed poor African-American kids and poor white kids. And what came out was sort of a microcosm of the findings of higher levels of optimism and hope among African-Americans. The adolescents I surveyed trusted others more. They loved their community. They wanted to achieve college, even if it was difficult for them. They said their parents supported them. And this was actually really consistent. And the low-income white kids who were better off financially, they tended to come from families that owned their homes, not in a great neighborhood, but they had much lower hope and aspirations, very little trust in others. They also had very weak relational ties. They had this individualistic vision, self-reliance, which is sort of the traditional American dream vision. But even if they wanted to, not many of the kids reported to want to, the parents actively did not support them getting education beyond high school. And if you think about tomorrow's labor markets, it's really depressing, because with a public high school education from low-income Missouri and $1, you can maybe buy a coat, right? I mean, it's really not going to get you far. And they also had no clue sort of what they would do next, or what the challenges were facing them. But back to the parents, I think that has become part of what is in part fueled by misinformation, also fueled by lack of hope for the future, is that there's this trust in higher education and in science now in a lot of these same places that's incredibly damaging. But the fact that it also translated to kids not wanting parents not wanting their kids to get better educated than they are, really, I thought that was really depressing. And that, minority kids who were much more underprivileged were much more hopeful and had higher aspirations. So there's a lot of, what to do, right? There are a lot of examples in the book, and I don't have time to go into them, of sort of some community programs that have tried to restore hope. Some of the ones that Jan Emanuel and Christian wrote about in an article, those were life satisfaction interventions, but it's not that. I think you can still use the same approach. And I think the very clear lesson in this research is the whole role of young people needing mentors. Wealthy kids tend to have a lot of access to everything, but one of the things that really struck me with these interviews was how uninformed all the kids were, both the hopeful and not hopeful ones, about how they needed to train for the job of the future. It just wasn't on their radar screen. And that's not even talking about AI and what's going to happen next. So the last thing, and then the question I have for all of you, I'm not going to kind of repeat and go through this again, except I love the Amanda Gorman quote. And I think it really reflects what makes hope distinct from, say, optimism. So you can have the tragic optimist who always thinks things will get better, but they're not really doing anything about it. And it may be a good survival tool if you're in difficult circumstances. But hope is exactly what she says. You don't just believe things will get better. You believe you can do something to make them better, to make your life better. And that's what leads to investments. And so the big question, the sort of causality question, is in addition to, the potential of community interventions to restore hope, but it also that you can't answer that question without answering this. So you can't just fix structural constraints, like providing people with more education or more moving to opportunity or all the things that we try and do. If people have no hope, they're not going to respond to incentives, right? But the other thing is you can't just fix structural constraints. I mean, you can fix structural constraints, but then if there's no hope or response, then that won't work. But now I got a bit muddled. See, I told you I was jet lag, Casper. But anyway, so the other thing is, you also can't try and build hope if the structural constraints are so big that people can't get ahead. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg problem. I personally think we need to take on both more than that we need to worry about what causes what, but that's a question I have for all of you. And then the last bullet is the title of my new book. I was supposed to bring a copy, but I didn't, so sorry about that. Anyway, I think I'm kind of okay
Certainly
on time.
Thank you, Carol.